Munich airport, and wreckage that tells the story of the dreadful disaster.
The 6th of February 1958, a date embedded in the very foundations of Manchester United. 23 people were killed after the plane carrying the team back home from a European match crashed on an icy Munich runway. 8 players died. Rivalries were put aside as the country mourned the loss of some of its greatest footballers. What followed was a remarkable rebuilding under Sir Matt Busby, the club's manager, who was also injured in the crash.
Then Bobby Charlton sets the ball rolling and the match of the season is underway.
That same season they went on to reach the FA Cup final. Then, just 10 years later, Busby guided the club to its first European title. The Busby Babes, as the team are now known, have been immortalised in football history ever since. And now the subject of David Peace's latest novel. For him, a labour of love.
Munich affected so many people in so many different ways. I also felt that it was a story that anybody who's interested in football has heard of it and knows about it. But at the time of a disaster, it was actually a national tragedy, something that affected the whole country. I think one of the things that made a huge impression on me was the story of Jimmy Murphy, who was Busby's assistant, and how in the midst of the grief that he suffered, losing colleagues Tom Curry and Bert Wally, who he worked with all the time and who he felt great guilt about having, Bert Wally went in place of Jimmy Murphy, losing the players who he treated and had known since they were 13, 14, who were like sons to him. But yet he, in the midst of all that grief, has to pick up United and keep United going and actually manage to take them to the FA Cup final within 3 months of a disaster. And I think that's one of the most incredible stories in sport. And it's also, to me, a story of hope. They refuse to be beaten by the tragedy. They refuse to be beaten by the grief.
He says, doesn't he, I have to show the young boys, the young men, that life goes on.
Yeah. Harry Gregg, the goalkeeper, Bill Fowkes, the defender, they came out of that tunnel 2 weeks after they'd walked away from the plane wreckage. Bobby Charlton, a week after that.
The Saturday matches were played, and that's how those who died would have wished.
There was no counselling, nothing. That they came out and they played just 2 weeks after being in an air crash in which they'd lost, most of their friends.
The very title that you've chosen, a little perplexing at first because you think Munich's the plural, but also controversial because it's been used by rival fans as a term of abuse.
And this was
sort of tragedy chanting. I mean, were you nervous about using it, or are you certain it was the right decision?
The idea of this happened to many, many different people. So, the fact that there were so many, that I wanted so many different voices and so many characters to show the extent of the tragedy, that actually meant Munich's was the right title for that reason. So I wouldn't have just done it just to provoke. But then, of course, once I thought Munich's would work as a title, I'm well aware that, some supporters of some clubs, use it as a term of mockery and abuse. Tragedy chanting, I've heard it in grounds and so forth, and I've heard United fans sing things as well. So, I just think that's one of the most sickening things of the modern game. I wanted to kind of hit that head on. I would dare someone to read this book and then to ever use Munich's as a term of abuse or a mockery, because this is something that, yes, it happened to Manchester United, but it happened to this country, it happened to the working class of this country, and it should be remembered as a national tragedy.
I think it's uglier now.
Football is only a reflection of the society in which it takes place, and so football doesn't cause the problems. Football is an integral part of the history of this country and the working class history of this country. This story is a story of grief and of loss, but it's also a story of how people came together and how people triumphed over grief and kept the club going.
Why is it so important that the working class element of all of this is to the fore?
I don't see a lot of working class literature.
Football grounds throughout the country flew flags at half-mast.
Yes, this is a sad story and a tragedy, but also it's a positive story. And I wanted to tell, what is ultimately a hopeful and positive working class story. But, regardless of where you're from, it's still the dream for, boys and girls now all over, because that dream is still alive, to kick a ball. And I don't think you can ever take, nothing can ever take that away.